evening and welcome to the latest edition of Resistance TV. I'm joined this evening by Natalie Strecker, who's an outstanding and inspirational campaigner and activist, to discuss a development in occupied Palestine that's affected a friend of the show, Issa Amro. Issa is an internationally renowned advocate for Palestinian human rights and non-violent resistance against Israel's occupation, and he's been targeted by the Zionist regime for years. The Israeli occupation forces have sealed off Issa's home inside a closed military zone after he'd complained about violent attacks from illegal settlers and intimidation from soldiers. Issa wanted to join us on the show tonight, but his current circumstances prevented him from doing so. He did, however, record this message for us.
The Israeli settlers, since a long time, they were asking the Israeli military to close my house in Tel Rumeda. They don't want me to talk to international and Israeli audience about the Israeli apartheid and the Israeli occupation. I was targeted in the last 20 years, indicted, convicted in the military court to shut off my voice and to stop youth against settlements from doing non-violence activities. The Israeli army used all types of tactics and strategies to isolate Yas, to stop me as well, by harassment, by detention, by arrest of the activist, by smear campaigns and damaging our reputation. They got help from the Palestinian Authority as well to stop us from what are we doing. On the other hand, lately we restarted our activities to do non-violence activities, and we were preparing to start a global anti-apartheid movement with other local and international partners. We started since 2 weeks to help the Palestinian families to pick their olives. We organized an olive harvest campaign. Locals, internationals, and Israelis joint efforts to help the families and protect them from the Israeli settlers. This kind of non-violence activities, the Israeli settlers didn't like it. So we faced a lot of army oppression, restriction, threats from the soldiers, detention, detaining the activists, detaining Palestinian kids who came to help with the olive harvest campaign. Last week we reached the maximum of the harassment. Me personally, I was attacked by Israeli soldiers, beaten physically by Israeli settlers. They throw stones toward my house, which I'm using it as Yas Community Center. They attacked us with sticks. They closed the road to the house, and they stole the phone of our media activist Mohannad Kafishi in front of the army without doing anything. We have a lot of videos. We had a lot of videos for them. I went to the police station 3 times, the Israeli police station, to file complaint. They refused to take the complaint. Then the Israeli settlers came to the land next to my house and start making bonfire, which is illegal. It's a private land. We called the police, and the reaction of the Israeli government, Israeli army, Israeli police was to punish the victim of the Israeli settlers and the Israeli soldiers, which is typical here because they have the power. They do whatever they want. And this is what happened with us. The Israeli settlers managed to convince the Israeli apartheid army to close only our house in Tel Rumeda. So I am now alone in the house. Nobody is allowed to visit me, no friends, no activists, no journalists, no family members. I am the only one in the house. I am completely isolated. It's as if I am in jail, and I really am afraid to leave the house, and then they come and take it, or they may not let me come back to the house. So I'm not leaving the house. I'm staying in until we solve it. The first closure was for 24 hours, and the soldiers came 1 hour ago and told us that the closure is renewed and nobody is allowed to enter. I want to start. We should start an international and local campaign to make it costly for them.
Well, they were chilling words to listen to, Natalie, and particularly so for me because I know Issa a little. Must be even more difficult for you because I know you have been to Issa's home in Hebron and you know quite well. Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of activities that Issa has been involved with, in particular the sort of activities that go on at that particular location?
Yeah, of course, Chris. And yeah, it's incredibly difficult, obviously, listening to Issa, understanding what's going on, and more widely what's happening within the community itself. You know, I'll always say it's a place I've left my heart, really. I was welcomed into the community in incredible ways, really. Their warmth and their hospitality, and really treated like a member of their families. So in terms of Youth Against Settlements, obviously it was set up in sort of late 2007, and it's, you know, what the centre does is it encourages the youth, young people, to take part in non-violence resistance as a means of empowering them. So the Issa worked with the community, like I said, especially the youth, in terms of how they could resist creatively. One of the things they get taught to do is how to use like cameras to film sort of the crimes that are happening there, which is really important. But they've also taken part in other things, like they have the Open Shuhada Street campaign every year, which obviously is a demand for that sort of sterile area. Remember that Shuhada Street was really the artery of commerce within the old city for many years, until it was closed during after Barak Goldstein's massacre at Il Brahimi Mosque, which of course was enabled by the Israeli military forces. So they have that every single year. It's something that different Palestinian solidarity groups take part in all around the world. That's included us here in Jersey. In the past, when Trump got elected and moved the embassy to the US embassy to Jerusalem, they had creative action where they had a big picture of Trump and they were throwing their shoes at it, which you probably know in the Middle East is considered like an insult. They've done things like they had the Martin Luther King themed protest where they wore masks. That's one of the times when Issa got obviously arrested. And then they've done things like praying in front of Shuhada checkpoint, the checkpoint 55 as it's known. So they've done all sorts of creative action. They also go to like South Hebron Hills to try and support with, you know, when obviously Palestinians are having their homes demolished in that area C. So they do a huge amount of stuff. But not just that, there's the social element of the centre as well. It's where the youth come together. I mean, it's where I used to spend almost every evening when I was in Hebron. We'd have a fire, often food would be cooked, we'd sing songs together, we'd share stories and talk. So there's also that element of that solidarity, you know, along with the empowerment, which makes it such an important centre. And Youth Against Settlements is really well known within the Hebron community. It's a centre that internationals regularly visit and stay at. They'll get lots of actually, I remember when I was there, when I supported a tour of MEPs there, and they went and visited, but lots of different individuals. You might even remember that a number of years ago, Richard Gere, actually the actor, went and visited Youth Against Settlements. So it really is one of the really important centres of resistance, but also of solidarity and, you know, that ability to socialise and support one another.
Why do you think they've targeted Issa so ferociously? I mean, the answer might be pretty obvious, but just unpack that a little bit more for us in terms of, you know, Issa being particularly singled out in the way in which he has.
Well, I think with Issa, I mean, he's obviously very courageous, he's outspoken, and I think the difficulty for Issa, I suppose, is also that the Palestinian Authority are also targeting him, because obviously Issa is resisting Israeli apartheid, but he also speaks very openly about the corruption within the Palestinian Authority, and therefore I suppose some would say he doesn't do himself any favours in that way. But for Issa, it's about values. It's really important to stand up and call out what's wrong, whether it's on the Israeli side or indeed the Palestinian side, as, you know, they continue their security arrangements with Israel. And it's really important to understand that the Palestinian Authority are able to operate in the way they do and operate in the way they do because they have the full support of Israel. And I think that a lot of people forget that sometimes. So that's really important. Obviously, obviously they target him because he's become very high profile, because Issa doesn't back down, and also because I can't remember where I read it, but years ago I remember reading something about how Israel doesn't know how to cope with non-violent resistance. Although, to be honest, they really are just as brutal with it now. But, it's easy when somebody is undertaking armed resistance. That's very obvious how they feel that they can respond to that. But when you've got somebody like Issa who's encouraging non-violent resistance, it kind of really threatens that narrative that they put out of seeing Palestinians as terrorists. I mean, regardless, Palestinians have the right to undertake armed resistance as they see fit within, obviously, international law, within parameters around that. But when it's non-violence, it's really difficult for them to use that narrative of being these, savage Middle Easterns, which is the racist narrative that Israel is obviously, continues.
Yes, no, indeed. I mean, I wonder whether you might be able to say a little bit as well, Natalie, for our viewers who may not be familiar with the arrangement between, with the Palestinian Authority, which is run, essentially by the Palestinians, but they obviously are collaborating with the Israeli regime. I mean, how did that come to pass? And, why is it that, they are sort of collaborating, it seems, with the occupation forces? I mean, the proud, tradition of Fatah, Yasser Arafat and so on. I mean, I wonder what he would make of the situation that the Palestinian Authority is, the role that they are fulfilling now, and and the circumstances that Palestinians are having to live under as a consequence of that sort of collaboration between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli occupation force.
Well, obviously a lot of this came about after the various peace accords, especially when we look at the Oslo peace accords, when, the West Bank got carved up into areas A, B, and C. The idea under those accords was that they would transfer into complete Palestinian authority over a period of time once the Palestinians were ready, which in itself is a very racist, settler, colonialist response to the situation. But obviously that never happened, as we know. But it was during that time really the Palestinian Authority gained more control. But in terms of the arrangement, basically they can't do anything without Israeli input. And if you look into a lot of the stuff that Abbas has done, which is absolutely horrendous, he's totally, he's a dictator himself. But obviously anyone who would be a legitimate leader of the Palestinian people in terms of politically gets imprisoned. There's a lot of evidence that demonstrates that. So I think, that the reason why they can continue it, because Abbas, although they're living in this hellish situation, he does benefit from it. Maybe it's just, I don't know, but possibly I would imagine it's around, well, how can I have the best life within this context? Yeah. How can I exercise more control, exercise power, because perhaps he doesn't believe there will be actual liberation. I don't know. No, obviously, he's benefiting from the circumstances. So, it all came about, as I said, after the Accords, but really the security arrangement they continue is really because they get something from it.
Of course. Power, I'm going to say, just for the benefits of our viewers who may not know who Abbas is, just say a little bit about him. And I think he cancelled some elections recently because he actually thought he was going to be ousted, as it were. Just say a little bit about him and about that process, about those elections that never took place.
Yeah, so obviously I don't know a huge amount in terms of all the things around that, in terms of the backgrounds, what sort of led to it, other than Abbas is a dictator, and as you said, the likelihood was that he was going to be ousted, because I think people have had enough because of the amount of compromises he's made that are really it makes the situation impossible. It's actually worsened the situation, I would say, has prolonged the occupation and apartheid. Abbas is obviously the leader, the prime minister, I think it is. I always forget whether president or prime minister, but anyway, of the Palestinian people. So, he's the official representative of the Palestinian government, if you like. But, as you said, he's extremely corrupt. He has really given away a lot of rights of the Palestinians. He's tried to suppress Palestinian resistance, and that has included Issa within that. And that's the thing, that he opposes things like boycott, divest, and sanction, or certainly has used rhetoric that would suggest that. So yeah, Abbas is no friend really of the Palestinian people, which is why, it's caused a huge number of issues. I think a lot of people have sort of given up. We know there's a recent report that was highlighted in Mondevice that demonstrates how mental health issues really have exploded, as you would, because people talk about PTSD. Well, they're not in a situation, the Palestinians, where they can have post-traumatic stress. They're suffering trauma every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And that's the reality, and this is something that's important to remember. This has been going on for 74 years now. We're talking about a 74-year project of ethnic cleansing, incremental genocide, occupation, and apartheid.
Yeah. Just so people can get their head around this, who may not be overly familiar with the situation in Palestine, would you say that the Palestinian Authority, sort of parallels with Vichy France, or is it even worse than that? Because I think people are kind of more familiar with Vichy France, because there's a kind of almost a news blackout, isn't there, about what happens in Palestine, as we know. So unsurprisingly, people are not really necessarily, as up to speed as you are.
Yeah, we're not allowed to talk about the collaborations of the Nazi era, not even in Jersey, actually. We know we had collaborators, but nobody is allowed to mention them. I would say probably it's very similar. Although I'm not saying that Abbas necessarily explicitly supports the Israel's vision, but it serves him to have that arrangement with them because he's getting something out of it. So I think it's slightly different in that, during Vichy, it was because they actively support sort of Nazi ideology. I wouldn't say that's the case with Abbas. Obviously I don't know the guy, but I would say it's more a case of actually, what can I get out of this situation? And like
unfortunately, Natalie, power corrupts, doesn't it? And
exactly,
it can do, and maybe that's a case in point with Abbas, and maybe that's what's gone wrong. Maybe he was a decent guy at one time, but what do you think, though? Just in terms of, because I think the work that people like Issa and the movement that he spearheaded, this kind of citizen journalism, which has I think helped to turn the tables in terms of public opinion anyway, in relation to what the Israeli regime's all about in reality. Because people are seeing it now. We've got citizen journalists, we've got smartphones. Many of them can speak good English now. So you go to the UN schools and things like that. So, and they're able to put this online, so people can see, the grotesque brutality, the racism, the apartheid, the last remaining kind of apartheid state, which is actively supported by the West. The fact that people are now more aware of that, and that's certainly true. When the last bombardment took place in Gaza, and there were demonstrations, marches all over this country and across the world, actually. But just on my home city, I think I mentioned this before on Resistance TV, that it was the biggest rally we've ever seen in Derby. Derby's not necessarily around for big rallies, but it was literally the biggest rally. It was unbelievable, and people were coming out of the shops, and there was a march the following week. There were people coming out of the shops and the pubs and applauding and joining in the rally. But with that, though, the flip side of that is that people are feeling, sort of very angry, but incredibly powerless, really, to do anything, really. And obviously, we've got the BDS campaign, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, which is something I think we should be getting behind and supporting. But there's a lot of pressure, isn't there now, from the government and so on, to actually outlaw BDS. Can you say a little bit about BDS, its origins, how successful it's been, what support there is for it in your experience when you've been over in Palestine speaking to people there, and what you think about the government's the possibility of the government actually outlawing BDS here?
I think to answer that sort of in reverse, I would say the Tory plan to outlaw BDS is criminal. There's no, the reality is people need to decide what they want. If you remove the possibility for non-violent resistance, which is what boycott, divest and sanction movement offers, then you're left with armed resistance, and people need to really, really understand that it's totally criminal to give a people that are suffering, being subjected to a crime against humanity, which is what apartheid is, that have suffered 74 years, as I said previously, of ethnic cleansing, incremental genocide, everything that settler colonialism brings, and that apartheid. It is absolutely criminal to say that they should be living on their knees and dying in silence, because that's what the Tory policy really, in effect, is saying. So I would say that it's totally criminal, and I would hope that there would be a challenge within the international court around that, because it's a justifiable and legitimate non-violent way of resisting everything that Palestinians are going through. We know it's been used successfully, at least to some degree, during South African apartheid. I mean, it's interesting because you see some of the, with what's happened with Kanye West, who did say some anti-Semitic, some pretty shocking things. And yet, look, they immediately started a boycott campaign for Adidas, and he got taken off that, So I think that it's absolutely criminal to say Palestinians need to suck it up and live on their knees. In terms of, what is it? I mean, hopefully it's sort of self-explanatory. It's boycotting, and that includes an academic boycott of Israel, boycott for some of settlement goods, but actually often it's more than that. It's about not doing, not taking part in any event, including something like Eurovision, that whitewashes Israeli crimes against the Palestinian people. Divest is obviously things that you'll probably know, divesting from pension schemes that would in any way support or enable Israeli apartheid to continue. And then obviously there's been some big brands that people have been asked to boycott, things like Caterpillar, HP, Hewlett Packard, and all who some because SodaStream were operating out of settlements, but also Hewlett Packard because the technology is used in Israeli prisons and at checkpoints, and we know it's used in munitions as well. Caterpillar because they're used to demolish Palestinian homes, which is a war crime. So that's the boycott, but also the divest. Sanctions generally is more to do with sanctioning Israel in that they can't continue to buy arms that they're not allowed, and obviously not to continue with the investment that they receive. I mean, there is a lot of debate around whether sanctions are effective or not. I think it's important to remember that, because often they do impact, obviously, the civilian population, as we're seeing in Russia, we've seen in Venezuela, in other places. But certainly there are sanctions that can be brought in that don't do that, like the inability to sell them weapons. In terms of how does the community feel about it? I mean, obviously there's I think some Palestinians who don't really have the headspace, if I'm honest, to really have that conversation. They just want, when I remember sort of trying to have a conversation with them, and it's not even, they just don't have the headspace to think about that. But overwhelmingly, the Palestinian community support that. And it's important to remember it was the Palestinian civil movement that called for boycott, divest and sanction. This is a call directly from them. So when people say, I get quite cross sometimes, even with organizations that, really do support Palestine, when they say, but we can't do BDS because it might be considered anti-Semitic. And I'm like, okay, what you're saying is as white Europeans is that we shouldn't allow ourselves to be directed by Palestinians who are the ones suffering settler colonialism in how they want us to respond. And I don't think that that's appropriate, and I don't think it's fair.
No, indeed. Well, look, I mean, I certainly know that the Zionist lobby are more than happy to support boycotts in defence of their own cause. Indeed, I was a victim of that. I was due to speak in Brighton 3 years ago when I was still a member of Parliament about modern monetary theory. Actually, there's nothing to do with the Palestinian question. And a number of venues were cancelled, but one of the venues that was tried after the first venue was cancelled was the Holiday Inn. Incredibly, Holiday Inn were threatened with a worldwide boycott if they allowed me to speak on their premises. And they were prepared to withstand that. I mean, they actually even withstood an online abusive campaign and abusive telephone calls. But I think the final, the thing that sort of made them change their mind about hosting the meeting was when two Zionist thugs went to the hotel and threatened the reception staff. And the reception staff felt very frightened, actually, and took time off work because they were so alarmed by what had happened. So there's, we know the brutality that is meted out in Israel, by the Israelis, should I say, in Palestine itself. So it's hardly surprising that people who excuse this behaviour and support the Zionist entity, are prone to those sorts of tactics themselves. But I mean, you talked about anti-Semitism there, and how that then is used and weaponized when people campaign for BDS, and people are fearful about being accused of anti-Semitism. But it was Shlomo Aloni, who a former Israeli minister, you will know this, but some of our viewers might not, was asked that very question on a TV program, I think like 20 years ago now, and about anti-Semitism. And she said, well, it's a trick. It's a trick that we always use to deflect attention away from the atrocity. I mean, she didn't, I'm paraphrasing now, but essentially to deflect attention away from the atrocities perpetrated by the Israeli regime. And that's why I think it's important that we stand up to that, isn't it? We've seen what happened inside the Labour Party. We've seen Sir Keir Starmer saying that he supports Zionism without qualification. Well, that means essentially he's making excuses for the treatment that Issa has been subjected to, let alone the massacres that we're seeing ongoing. I mean, would you agree with that? I mean, what's your thoughts on what I've just said there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is a trick. It's just an attempt to change the subject from, the crimes that Israel is committing against, its indigenous the indigenous population of the area, to talking about another form of racism. I mean, and I won't entertain it, as you know, Chris. I think obviously real anti-Semitism is abhorrent. There's no question about it. It's concerning when we see the rise of the far right, internationally. But, we know that some of the biggest anti-Semites, including people like Orban and Trump, absolutely, support wholeheartedly Israel and the Zionist ideology. I mean, when we look at people like Richard Spencer, Tommy Robinson, Katie Hopkins, all declaring themselves proudly to be Zionist, it's very clear what this is about. Zionism is a form of ethnic, superiority. It's ethnic supremacy. And we know that actually not all Jews are Zionists. We know that actually the vast majority or the largest portion of Zionists are in fact Christians, a lot evangelical, and not because they care about Jews, but because they want Jesus to come back and either Jews will convert or they'll be destroyed, so it's not because they care about the Jewish community.
Absolutely.
So I think that, absolutely, there is this weaponization. It's interesting at the moment because obviously you have the IHRA definition, which is a horrendous definition, was never, Kenneth Stern, who was a chief architect of it, said it was never to be used in the way that it's being used now. But what's interesting is you're seeing more and more in the Israel lobby violating the IHRA definition itself by constantly replacing the Jewish community with Israel and saying that if you criticize Israel, and you're just like, but you're violating the definition which you demanded was to be adopted. So, and that's why, like, in some ways I'm like, let's not even talk about it. Say whatever you like, it's a tactic, but actually don't entertain it anymore. That's my position now, is we don't entertain it, and let's talk about, Palestinians suffering, being murdered, being subject to, war crimes and crimes against humanity every single day.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, one of the facets of the Zionist movement is that they're certainly guilty of overreach. Nothing is ever enough for them. They always want more. ironically, I see Sir Keir Starmer has been subjected to some attacks from the Zionist lobby, which is quite an irony. But just in terms of going back to Issa, I mean, I know you know him quite well, Natalie. I mean, how's he bearing up with this? It must be a incredible strain. I mean, all his life it's been one long struggle, but this latest development must be really troubling for him. How's he bearing up?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's been really difficult, to listen to him, how he is. He's a human being at the end of the day. And I quite often, say this to people. We tend to put, these great leaders of yesteryear on pedestals as if they're superheroes with special powers. But the reality is they were just human beings with fears, with flaws, just with an absolute commitment to justice and whatever their struggle was. And that's true of Issa today. He's obviously been recognized or called the Palestinian Gandhi in media in the past, but ultimately he's a human being trying to struggle in the most impossible of circumstances. So he is struggling at the minute. I think there's no question about it. It's been hard because obviously, this has been going on. I mean, ever since Youth Against Settlements were set up, they've been trying to take over the house. So if I can talk to you maybe a little bit, Chris, about what it looks like there. So you have Terra Meda, which is really important historically. It's an ancient, obviously, area. It's, there's even the tombstone I remember seeing when I was there. But it's beautiful. It's prime land in the area. They've still got ancient olive groves. So you've got the centre, and it's totally surrounded on one side by settlements. And we're talking about the most violent settlers that exist. So he's constantly, I remember actually the first time I visited in 2016, Issa and I have been friends really online, through Zoom calls from 2015, but I first met him in person in 2016. And I remember coming out, settlers shouting abuse, but I remember coming out with a bottle of water with an associate of mine. And a soldier was just standing there with a sniper pointing a gun at us. And I was just like, I've got a bottle of water. It was ludicrous. But obviously, it's much worse for Palestinians. I mean, when I was there, obviously, when I served as a human rights monitor in the area, I mean, they were constantly having people attack, settlers throwing stuff, settlers shouting out abuse. Issa has worked with the youth and internationals who visited and supported to put a fence up around the area to try and protect them a little bit. But you also feel like you're caged in, you're imprisoned. And certainly now, because it's under military order, he doesn't feel safe at all. He's by himself. Nobody's allowed to visit him, not even journalists or lawyers or internationals or family members. Nobody is allowed to visit him. And he can't leave because we know as soon as he leaves, the settlers are likely to go in and take the place, which is what they've been planning to do. Terra Meda, actually, that area has been under military, has been a closed military zone since 2015. Obviously, they've and the property several times has been closed, but they've managed to get it reopened. But this time it's looking, it's difficult to know how this is going to play out. I do worry for Issa because I think about how is he getting food into the
exactly.
area.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you that. Yeah.
And that's the thing. And to be by yourself, I mean, that's why it's really important for us to be raising our voices, to raise awareness, because, part of when I had my conversation with Issa today and yesterday, actually, he talked about feeling that they weren't being heard. We know that there's actually, I would say that public sympathy for Palestine has hugely grown in terms of the public in general. The tide has turned. The problem is the international community aren't doing anything. So although we see a huge rise in the general population supporting the Palestinian rights, this isn't translating into any actual change or any intervention of any kind. We obviously get your, oh, we're sorry, or, to hear these things, empty statements that we hear from the EU, the UN, and all the rest of it. So I think that how long does a people last? that degree, of abuse. We're talking about 74 years. How many indigenous populations have survived decades and decades of constant abuse and being regarded as subhuman? Because that's what Palestinians are regarded as. And I think it's really important to understand that. So I'm deeply concerned for the community as a whole, for their mental and physical well-being. But I'm also concerned for Issa, because Issa's a good friend of mine. I couldn't have asked for a better friend when I was out there, to be honest.
Well, that's a trait of settler colonialism, isn't it? I mean, we're seeing settler colonialism in real time in Palestine. I mean, the United States of America, all the Americas, in fact, are settler colonial states. Australia, is another settler colonial state. It was the European nations that went and basically annihilated the indigenous populations, and then this is what is happening in Palestine. And we've got, these Israelis. Virtually none of them are from the region. They talk about the historic kind of right to their kind of homeland, stretching back allegedly to sort of 2,000 years or so. But they're kind of mainly from from Europe and from the United States of America. The Ashkenazi Jewish community, and it's an absolute anathema. What on earth? How on earth as well? Are the media not sort of reporting this accurately? Well, we know why, of course. Because the Zionist lobby is a very powerful lobby. But look, we've got BDS, and we need to obviously stand up for that and try and support it as best we can, notwithstanding the legal measures that the government are trying to put through. But what else do you think people watching the show this evening can do? In their trade unions, if they're members of political parties, in their community organisations. Are there things that they can do there to show their solidarity, practically show their solidarity and support?
I would say, obviously, you have got boycott, divest, sanction, and making the argument for that, educating people, educating yourself, not allowing the Palestinian cause to be forgotten, to keep raising it, support Palestine Action. I would say that's a real practical way for those who are brave enough to take part in that.
Just say a little bit more about Palestine Action, because they are really inspirational. They've taken direct action really very seriously and are chasing out of Britain, the Israeli arms manufacturer Elbit, but they're also targeting others that are involved in supplying weapons to the Israeli regime. I guess a lot of viewers will be familiar, but just say a little bit about that, and I don't know if you know what people could maybe do to support, if they don't want to or feel too intimidated to maybe get involved in the direct action themselves. What are there other ways in which they can support Palestine Action? But just say a little bit about what Palestine Action do and how people might be able to support them.
Yeah, so Palestine Action are a direct action group. Really, I would say they originated in Manchester, if I remember correctly. I know Huda for a number of years now, and AD, who were sort of really heavily involved in that. And they, it sort of really grew even bigger really after the arms conventions, because they quite often got took part in like Stop Dicey and stuff, which is stuff that I've taken part in. So trying to stop arms from being delivered to, one of the largest international arms conventions that takes place in London and in other places, where they try and obviously sell their weapons to, military industrial complex to, some of the most heinous regimes of the world, despot nations and people, nations like Israel. So that sort of grew. I think what happened was, after a while, when they realized that things weren't moving forward, the international community, they had made tokenistic statements but weren't actually doing anything. And I think after, the continued sort of violent escalations against the civilian population, blockaded civilian occupation of Gaza, but also what was happening in the West Bank more generally, I think they thought about, well, what can we do? And that's when they decided to start targeting, as you said, Elbit, the arms factories, and go, right, let's, this is where it starts. Let's do what we can. So they've obviously been occupying sites. They've been, smashing, trying to do what they can to smash up part of it, to make it so that it's not financially viable for that arms manufacturer to continue to operate out of the UK. Because let's remember, these companies are responsible or enabling war crimes. There's no ifs or buts around it. This is what they're doing, and it's starting. And really, who of us, reasonable person of conscience, would want such a company within our community? We should be pushing them out. So they've been targeting them, and obviously they've been successful in that. Some have sort of shut down. Obviously they face, they keep going, getting arrested and going to court. But what we also know is a lot of the time, actually, Elbit hasn't really been pushing charges or doing much. Because what they don't want is for the, for the defence to bring into that, court forum or court arena, why they're doing it, the reasons, the motivations for it, which they would be talking about the crimes that have been committed, against humanity. And as we know, Elbit supplies some of the worst regimes as well. That's who their weapons are being sold to. So it's not just about Israel, even like I know part of it associated with Kashmir. I would say that if people aren't, perhaps feel a little bit intimidated, and we've all got different responsibilities, it's not possible for all of us to go and take part in those type of actions, even if we support them. But there are other ways we can support, whether it's by sharing what they're doing, whether it's by supporting their legal costs. Ronnie Barkan, who's a good friend of mine, Israeli dissident, is obviously under house arrest at this very moment in Brighton. So you can support him because he's not making a living whilst he's in the UK. He's not allowed to go anywhere. So these are other ways that we can support. And I know some people find it difficult and are worried about what that might result in terms of putting people off the struggle. But I disagree. I think, there's all different types of ways we can resist. And actually, we have an obligation, because let's not forget, this mess was really started by Britain, by the government of Britain. And I think we have a particular obligation for that reason to take part in that struggle, So I do think that there is that sort of obligation there. But there are different ways, whether it's lobbying Parliament, whether it's lobbying our political representatives, and just make sure that the crimes that are committed against the Palestinian people aren't done in silence, and we can all take part in that.
Absolutely. I mean, what I would say about Palestine Action is that they've made more progress, and without wanting to, say anything against the Palestine Solidarity Movement in this country, but I think they've made more progress in practical, tangible results through their direct action tactics. And that's because the political process has utterly failed. It's utterly failed the Palestinian people. It's utterly failed, people of decent conscience in this country. Right across the political spectrum. From Tory to Labour. I mean, you've got Gordon Brown. I think he was the first British Prime Minister to address the Knesset. It's horrendous. It's horrendous. I mean, are you optimistic about the future for the Palestinian people?
At this moment, I would say no. But we know that things can happen and change very quickly. I mean, I would say that we don't have time to tinker around the edges, which is why I support Palestine Action. And I would like to see other things. I don't know if you remember Block the Boat, that was taking place in different countries around the world, where they were trying to stop Israeli goods from being delivered.
Yes, indeed. I mean, a very tangible sort of BDS tactic, as it were. And I mean, this is where the trade unionists, can play a part. In those kind of key strategic sort of industries, really. And to refuse to handle Israeli goods. Absolutely.
And I definitely think that. I remember, I don't know if you ever watched Ne Pasaran about, Chile, and that was such a fantastic thing. There is stuff you can do. And I think trade unions also have become very reserved in this regard a lot of the time, to be honest. And I find that deeply concerning. So I think
just say a little bit about that movement, because it was inspirational. Just say a little bit about that and how that might translate.
Yeah, so obviously, I mean, it was a time when unions had more power, but it was obviously a small group of guys when they found out, obviously, about Pinochet's regime in Chile. They decided to blacklist, I think it's what you call it, basically they shut shop up, said we are not working on these things, and on the
this was manufacturing goods, wasn't it? And yes, that's right.
Manufacturing the engines for the the airplanes that were dropping bombs and all the rest of it. So so that's what happened, and they never knew whether that, I think it ended up in Chile, the government talking about it. There was huge concern around it, but actually the guys never knew whether they had succeeded in any way or whether it actually made a difference. And what became apparent as you watch the documentary is years later, in their later years, they found out that their actions saved 8 lives. I think it was 8 lives, but certainly, a number of lives, which was incredible. But the thing is that, sometimes we may not know. We may not get to see the fruition, the blossoming of the plants or the seeds that we've planted, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. And I think that I really would encourage anyone who's not watched it to watch it, because there's no reason why we can't do similar. I mean, obviously, like I said, the union obviously has lost a lot of its power that it did at that time, but there are still things that can be done. And I would encourage union members to really demand their unions, to, representatives, to be much braver on this issue and take a much, a greater stance, because these have been crimes. And I often say, to people when they say to me, why should I care about Palestine and why should we care? And I said, political landscapes change all the time. This is happening to Palestinian people, but who's to say it won't happen to another people, to us? In a period of time, would we not hope that people on the other side of the world would be doing something to try and help us? So I think it's really important to keep these things in mind. I mean, how do I feel about stuff? Like I said, it's really difficult to not give into pessimism, but I also know we don't have the luxury of despair. So we have to keep going. I think when we look at what's sort of happening at the moment, it's a really interesting time in Palestine, because we're seeing a return, or a growing movement like Lion's Den. I think you were going to talk about.
Yes, the armed resistance to the Zionist entity is making significant progress, it seems to me, and I support the armed struggle. I mean, I'm a kind of pacifist. In fact, I actually support the armed struggle because, you say, 70 odd years of talking and so on has not worked, and politicians aren't listening. And we saw the ability of the resistance last year in Gaza to repel the Israeli occupation forces. So, I mean, this is an interesting development in Palestine with, like you mentioned, Lion's Den and the gender brigades before that, etc. And so I think, Palestinians are taking it in their own hands to resist in different ways. I think it's important that we offer our support to that. I think it's crucial, in my opinion, that people interested in politics, have an internationalist perspective. That trade unions have an internationalist perspective. We need to move away from a sort of myopic sort of view of the world, and it's only kind of just focusing in Britain. We need to have, it seems to me, that internationalist perspective. We have a moral obligation to do that. But look, Natalie, we're almost out of time now, and I just wanted to sort of close the show this evening with a really moving song, actually, which I think has been recorded now, and it may be being released at some point. I don't know. But it was a song that was performed when you were in Hebron, at Issa's place, I believe, and it's Issa's place, I believe. And I think it would be fitting, really, to conclude this evening's show by playing that, because fortuitously somebody filmed it and put it out on YouTube. So we do have access to it. And you had the privilege, obviously, of being there and sitting between the two musicians. But say a little bit about that, because I think the atmosphere really comes through. The words are amazing. It's a beautiful song. But just say a little bit about that night and about that song, and you can sort of introduce it, and then we'll close the show by just playing the song.
Fantastic. Okay. So it was an incredible night. Like I said, Youth Against Settlements, the social aspect of the centre was really important. Actually, the song is written by a friend of mine who'd come to visit me as I was serving as a human rights monitor in Hebron. And he had written it like a few months before, and he had met Al Major Mohammed just the day before. And then we agreed to meet up at Youth Against Settlements, and they just decided to basically, I don't know, you call it jam? Is that the term you use? And so what they did was Tom played his song which is call a spade, you know, which was about Israeli apartheid. And he, El Major, into that, played, you know, sung one of his songs. You know, obviously it was the first time they had really sat down together and just decided to jam together and sing this song together, which is really powerful. So the actual Palestinian song, he's talking about his you know, that it's a little boy who gets shot, and he's telling the person who's speaking to him, the Palestinian who's speaking to him, please tell my mum I'm not afraid to die. So it's about, you know, a resistance, and it's about a young person dying. That's the Arabic part of it. But it was an incredible night. We had fire. There was actually a lot of internationals visiting that evening, so we actually sung Bella Ciao as well after that. It was probably one of the most precious evenings of my period there.
Right.
So it's
it's an evocative song, and hopefully it will inspire people. Thanks everybody for watching this evening. We'll be back next week at the usual time. We Thursday this evening, but next week we'll be back at 7 o'clock on Wednesday. But let's play this tune now. Thank you, Natalie, for joining us this evening, and thank everybody for tuning in as well.
Spade, spade. There's nothing in between. When oppressing people in their land, the worst injustice they have seen. Let's call a spade, spade. There's nothing in between. What should we call this? Segregation and apartheid regime. And to call everything by its true and proper name. You can change the words, but your actions, they remain the same. No Orwellian doublespeak. It's time to be clear. The breaking of disguise is what they well and truly fear. Well, let's call a spade a spade. There's nothing in between. When oppressing people in their land, the worst injustice they've seen. يا بلادي يا بلادي أنا بحبك يا بلادي 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 قولوا لي أمي ما تزعليش وحياتي عندك ما تعيطيش قولوا لي أمي ما تزعليش وحياتي عندك ما تعيطيش قولوا لها معلش يا أمي أموت أموت وبلدنا تعيش أمانة تبوسوا لي إيديها وتسلموا لي على بلادي. Call a spade a spade. There's nothing in between. When oppressing people in their life, the worst injustice they have seen. Let's call a spade a spade. There's nothing in between. What should we call this? Segregation and apartheid regime. Shame and no words to hide behind. You can call it defense, but to think that you'd have to be blind. You can't call it democracy if you don't give equal rights. With Zionist ideologies pursuing genocide, let's call a spade a spade. There's nothing in between. When oppressing people in their land, the worst injustice they have seen. Let's call a spade a spade. There's nothing in between. What should we call this segregation? An apartheid regime. You shout national security, we say it is ethnic cleansing. How can you be a democracy while your oppression's never ending? You say you believe in Zionism, we say it's racist, state-sponsored terrorism. We have to be brave enough to see we need justice, we need peace. You shout national security, we say it is ethnic cleansing. How can you be a democracy where your oppression's never ending? You say you believe in Zionism, we say it's racist, state-sponsored terrorism. We have to be brave enough to see we need justice, we need peace. Well, let's call a spade a spade. It's nothing in between. When oppressing people in their land, the worst injustice that you've seen. Let's call a spade a spade. There's nothing in between. What should we call this segregation? An apartheid